Imagine for a moment that you're walking alone through a deserted street in Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. It's exactly 11:17 p.m. on an October night. The cold mountain wind cuts across your face, and the streetlights flicker irregularly, creating dancing shadows on the cracked asphalt. Suddenly, you hear something that makes your blood freeze in your veins. The deep rumble of a diesel engine approaching from behind, accompanied by 3 long, insistent honks of a horn. You turn slowly, expecting to see the headlights of an old bus approaching through the darkness. But when you look, there's nothing, just the absolute emptiness of dawn. However, the sound continues. The noise of gears being shifted, the grinding of worn brakes, even the metallic echo of a door opening with a characteristic hiss. And then, a weak voice whispers in the wind, "Next stop, end of the line. This is not fiction. This has been happening for 38 years on the streets of the Honduran capital." And the story you're about to hear today goes far beyond a simple urban legend. It's a mystery that began with the disappearance of 25 people in a single night and transformed into a curse that continues to claim lives to this day. October 23, 1986. Tegucigalpa plunged into the darkness of another violent night. It was a Thursday like any other in that dark decade, when Honduras bled in silence under the weight of the Cold War, and the capital had become an urban battlefield where death was a constant companion to residents. At exactly 11:17 p.m., a blue and white bus, with the number 47 painted on its weather-worn sides, departed from the last stop in the El Carrizal neighborhood heading to the city center. It was an old vehicle, manufactured in 1967, with almost 20 years of intensive use on the potholed streets of the capital. The diesel engine rumbled irregularly, the seats were torn, and the windows had cracks that created spider web patterns on the fogged glass. Behind the wheel was Ramon Castillo, a 34-year-old man, married, father of 3 small children. Ramon wasn't just any driver. He had 8 years of professional experience without a single traffic violation, was respected by colleagues and beloved by regular passengers, who knew him for his warm smile and religious punctuality. On that specific night, he had taken an extra shift to cover for a sick colleague. A seemingly simple decision that would forever seal his destiny and that of everyone who boarded that cursed bus. On board were 23 passengers. Each of them had a story, a family waiting at home, dreams and fears like any normal person. Maria Elena Vasquez, 28 years old, was a seamstress who worked late at a clothing factory to support her young daughter and sick mother. She always took the last bus because one shift's salary wasn't enough. She needed the overtime hours to pay rent for a small room in the periphery. Also on the bus were 3 university students. Carlos, 20 years old, an engineering student who had missed the last regular bus after a night class. Sandra, 19 years old, who was studying nursing and returning from a hospital internship. And Miguel, 22 years old, who worked during the day and studied at night, always carrying a heavy backpack full of books borrowed from the library. There was also an elderly couple, Don Fernando and Dona Esperanza, both over 70 years old, who had spent the day visiting a sick son who lived in the city center. They had been taking this bus for more than 5 years and had known Ramon since he started working on the line. They always sat in the second seat on the right side and talked quietly about grandchildren, about the cost of living, about how the city was becoming increasingly dangerous. 2 children were also on board. Sofia, 8 years old, and her younger brother, Alejandro, 6 years old. They were returning home accompanied by their grandmother, Dona Carmen, after a day of playing at cousin's house. The children were tired and sleepy, leaning against the window, watching the city lights pass by like blurred stars. And there was Rosa Maria, a 25-year-old woman 8 months pregnant, who was on her way to the hospital because she was feeling irregular contractions. She was traveling alone because her husband was working the midnight shift at a factory, and the neighbor who had promised to accompany her had ended up getting sick. Rosa Maria held her belly with both hands and breathed deeply, trying to control her anxiety. The list was completed by a heterogeneous group of night workers. A baker who started his shift at 2 a.m., 2 cleaning ladies who cleaned offices during the early morning, a security guard who was going to take over the doorway of a commercial building, and some other passengers whose identities were lost in the incomplete police files of the time. What no one knew that night was that they were about to become protagonists of one of the most disturbing mysteries in Central America. Witnesses at the final stop in El Carrizal later reported that everything seemed completely normal when Bus 47 departed. The engine was running well, there were no signs of mechanical problems, and Ramon waved through the window to the traffic controller, a gesture he had made religiously every night for years. The vehicle's lights worked perfectly. Headlights, taillights, hazard lights, everything in order. The bus followed the usual route, a winding road that serpentined through the hills around Tegucigalpa. The first part of the journey proceeded normally. The vehicle stopped at 3 intermediate points, where some passengers boarded and others got off. Everything within the usual routine. The last time anyone saw Bus 47 was at 11:31 p.m., when it passed the Shell gas station located at the base of El Picacho Hill. Miguel Santos, the attendant on duty, remembers that moment perfectly because he found it strange to see such a full collective at that late hour. Normally, the last buses passed half empty, with only some night workers and late students. The bus was completely lit up. Miguel told me years later, during an interview I conducted to reconstruct the events of that night. I could perfectly see the driver. He even waved at me, as he always did. I saw the passengers in the windows, some sleeping, others looking outside. There were even children on board. Everything seemed absolutely normal. 15 minutes later, when I closed the station and left to go home, no vehicle had passed down the hill. And that was impossible because there was only one road. What happened in the next 14 minutes remains a mystery to this day. The distance between the gas station and the final stop in the city center was only 6 kilometers. A journey that, even with traffic and the precarious road conditions, never took more than 15 minutes to complete. At 11:45 p.m., families began to worry. Maria Elena always called home as soon as she arrived at the final stop. It was an agreement she had with her teenage daughter, who stayed taking care of the sick grandmother. The 3 university students had promised their parents they would be home before midnight, a time limit rigorously respected due to the growing urban violence. Rosa Maria was expected at the hospital, where a nurse on duty had already prepared a stretcher in the obstetric emergency. When the clock struck 12:15, and none of the passengers had given news, the first desperate phone calls began to arrive at the police. At 2 a.m. on October 24th, the first official missing person report was registered at the Central Police Station in Tegucigalpa. By 6 a.m., there were already 15 families in total despair looking for their loved ones. The official investigation began the next morning, led by Inspector Carlos Mendoza, a police veteran with 20 years of experience in urban crimes. Mendoza was known for being an extremely skeptical man who didn't believe in mysteries without logical and rational solutions. He had investigated hundreds of cases of kidnappings, homicides, and disappearances during the turbulent years of the 1980s, and always found an explanation based on concrete evidence. He had no idea that this specific case would haunt him for the rest of his life, transforming his convictions and forcing him to question everything he had always believed. The first hypothesis was the most obvious and, statistically, the most probable: kidnapping followed by murder. The Honduran authorities knew of at least 3 criminal groups that operated specifically in the El Picacho Hill region, all specialized in attacks on buses and public transport vehicles. These criminal strategy was always the same: block the road with tree branches or stones, approach the vehicle pretending to be passengers in distress, steal all the occupants' belongings, eliminate witnesses to avoid later identification, and dispose of the vehicle in some deep ravine or dismantle it to sell the parts on the black market. This type of crime had become sadly common in 1980s Honduras. In 1986 alone, At least 12 buses from different companies had been attacked in the metropolitan region of Tegucigalpa, resulting in dozens of deaths and disappearances. In most cases, the victims' bodies were found weeks later in clandestine graves, and the vehicles appeared completely dismantled in peripheral junkyards. Based on this previous experience, Inspector Mendoza organized the largest search operation in Honduran police history up to that point. Specialized teams searched every square centimeter within a 50-kilometer radius around El Picacho Hill. Divers explored all the lakes, rivers, and dams in the region. Military helicopters loaned by the American Army made low flights over the mountainous area for 2 consecutive weeks. Bloodhounds trained to locate human bodies traveled trails, ravines, and natural caves. The operation involved more than 200 people, including police, firefighters, military, and volunteers from local communities. Resources equivalent to $500,000 were invested, an astronomical amount for the standards of the time and country. Never before had Honduran authorities mobilized so many resources to investigate a single disappearance case. And in 15 days of intensive and exhaustive searches, working 24 hours a day in uninterrupted shifts, absolutely nothing was found. Not a fragment of the bus, not a piece of clothing from the passengers, not a bloodstain, not even a suspicious footprint on the ground. It was as if 25 people and an 8-ton vehicle had simply dissolved into thin air. It was exactly at this point in the investigation, when all rational hypotheses had been exhausted, that the impossible-to-explain reports began. The first was from Carlos Rivera, an experienced taxi driver who had worked in the region for more than 10 years and knew every curve, every pothole, every detail of those mountain roads. It was November 2nd, 1986, just 10 days after the original disappearance, when Carlos lived an experience that would change his life forever. It was exactly 11:30 p.m. when I was going down El Picacho Hill with a passenger. Carlos told me during an interview I conducted in 1994, 8 years after the events. Suddenly, I heard an insistent horn behind me, 3 long honks. It was the code that bus drivers used to signal emergency. I looked in the rearview mirror and clearly saw 2 headlights approaching at high speed. I thought it was a desperate driver, maybe taking someone to the hospital, so I pulled over to the side to give complete passage. Carlos stopped the taxi and waited. He could perfectly hear the rumble of the diesel engine, the sound of gears being shifted, even the hiss of pneumatic brakes. The sound got louder and louder, as if the vehicle was passing right next to his taxi. But when I got out of the car to see what was happening, Carlos continued, with an expression of terror that remained vivid even 8 years later, there was absolutely nothing on the road. It was completely empty, without a single vehicle in any direction. But I could still hear the sound of the bus moving away, going down the hill, until it completely disappeared. The passenger who was in the taxi at that moment confirmed the story. He had also heard the sounds of the ghost bus, but, like Carlos, couldn't see any vehicle. 3 days later, it was Ana Morales' turn, a nurse who worked the night shift at Hospital Escuela and took buses in the same region every day for more than 5 years. I was at the bus stop waiting for the 11:45 p.m. collective, Ana told me. It was a very cold night with fog, so everything was kind of blurred. Suddenly, I heard the characteristic sound of a diesel bus approaching. I started waving and getting the fare money, as I always did. The noise got louder and louder, as if the bus was stopping right in front of me. I even heard the sound of the door opening with that typical pneumatic hiss of old buses. Ana extended her hand with the money and took a step toward where the vehicle door should be. But when the fog cleared for a few seconds, she realized she was completely alone at the bus stop. There was no vehicle, no engine sound, nothing but the absolute silence of dawn. I was paralyzed with terror, Ana continued, because I was absolutely sure of what I had heard. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't fatigue from the shift. It was the real sound of a bus stopping to pick me up. But there was nothing there. The reports multiplied rapidly, always following the same inexplicable pattern. Sound of diesel engine, horns honking 3 times in a row, sound of grinding brakes and doors opening, but no visible vehicle. Always between 11:15 p.m. and 11:45 p.m. Always in the El Picacho Hill region. Always involving people who didn't know each other and had no reason to invent fantastic stories. Inspector Mendoza initially dismissed all these reports as collective hysteria, a psychological phenomenon common after tragedies that deeply impact a community. He had studied similar cases during his police training and knew that collective fear can generate auditory and visual hallucinations in perfectly normal and balanced people. But the situation changed completely when his own wife, Dolores Mendoza, who worked as a night teacher at a technical school, reported having lived the same impossible experience. "My wife was the most rational and skeptical person I knew," the inspector told me years later, shortly before retiring. "She always said I made up stories about cases to impress people. When she came to me, trembling with fear, saying she had heard the ghost bus, I knew something very strange was really happening." In December 1986, 2 months after the original disappearance, the first report of a possible survivor emerged. Eduardo Fernandez, a 19-year-old young man, appeared at a police station in Comayagua, 65 kilometers from Tegucigalpa, in a state of deep shock. He was dirty, with torn clothes, speaking incoherently and showing clear signs of severe psychological trauma. It took 3 days for him to be able to form complete and coherent sentences. When he finally spoke, his story defied any known logic. Eduardo said he was on the bus that fateful night, the Comayagua delegate told me. He described the vehicle's interior perfectly, new details that hadn't been disclosed by the press. Remembered driver Ramon, the pregnant woman, the children. But his version of events was impossible. According to Eduardo, everything had started normally. The bus was following the usual route, passengers were talking or dozing, and driver Ramon was humming a popular song of the time. But when the vehicle began to climb El Picacho Hill, something inexplicable began to happen. The lights outside started to flicker, Eduardo reported to investigators. They weren't street lights. They were lights that seemed to come from the air itself, as if we were going through an electrical storm. But there was no storm. There were no clouds. The night was clear. Then the bus started to accelerate strangely. Eduardo described an acceleration impossible for a vehicle of that type. According to him, the bus began to move at a speed that defied the laws of physics, as if it were no longer in contact with the asphalt. Passengers began to scream in terror, holding onto the seats while the vehicle seemed to float down the road. And then, Eduardo continued, I saw something I could never forget. I looked out the window and there was no more landscape outside. It was just absolute darkness, as if we were traveling through emptiness. That's when I jumped. Eduardo said he forced the emergency window and threw himself from the moving bus. When he regained consciousness, he was alone on a completely different road, kilometers away from where he should be. There was no sign of the bus, no sound of an engine moving away, no taillights disappearing in the distance. Eduardo's story was received with deep skepticism by authorities. Medical examinations found no injuries consistent with a fall from a vehicle at high speed. Furthermore, there was no official record of him as a passenger on the bus that night. His name was not on the list of missing persons, and no family had reported his disappearance. But Eduardo knew internal details of the case that had not been disclosed to the public. He perfectly described the seating arrangement, the specific defect that Bus 47 had in the rear window glass, even the scar that driver Ramon had on his left hand, information that only someone who had really been inside the vehicle could know. And Eduardo was not the only survivor to appear. Throughout 1987, more people appeared in different cities in Honduras, all reporting having escaped from the ghost bus under equally impossible circumstances. All knew internal details of the case. All described the same supernatural experience. And all were found in distant locations from where they should be, without injuries, but in a state of deep psychological shock. In March 1987, exactly 5 months after the original disappearance, the Transportes El Carrizal company definitively closed its doors. The psychological pressure on employees had become unbearable. Drivers categorically refused to work the night shift. Passengers completely abandoned the line. The company's revenue plummeted to zero, making it impossible to maintain operations. The route was taken over by another company, Transportes Unidos, but with radical changes in schedules. The last bus started leaving at 10 p.m., and no collective circulated in the region after 10:30 p.m. It was a preventive measure based on pure and simple terror. But the preventive measures did not prevent the phenomenon from spreading beyond mysterious sounds. Dona Carmen Lopez, who lived in a house near one of the old line stops, began documenting events in a kind of personal diary that she showed me years later. Every night, exactly between 11:15 p.m. and 11:45 p.m., we heard that horn, Dona Carmen told me. Always 3 consecutive honks, then the unmistakable sound of pneumatic brakes from an old bus. It was so real that my children ran to the window expecting to see the vehicle. But there was never anything. What most disturbed Dona Carmen was the absolute regularity of the phenomenon. It was as if the ghost bus followed a rigorous schedule, just as it did when it was still a real vehicle transporting real passengers. Sometimes, when the brake noise stopped, I could swear I heard voices. Dona Carmen continued. They were low voices, as if people were talking inside the bus, but I could never understand what they were saying. It was like listening to a conversation through a very thick wall. In 1988, 2 years after the disappearance, young people from Tegucigalpa began to create a macabre ritual that became known as Ghost Hunt. Groups of teenagers gathered at the old bus stops of the El Carrizal Centro line at exactly 11:17 p.m., armed with cameras and recorders, trying to capture evidence of the ghost bus. Some of these young people swore they had managed to photograph strange shadows or record inexplicable sounds. But the photos always came out blurred or completely dark, and the recorders captured only static noise impossible to interpret. What was even more disturbing was that some of these ghost hunters began to disappear. Between 1987 and 1995, at least 8 people mysteriously disappeared in the El Picacho Hill region during these night expeditions. Police established constant ostensive patrolling in the area, but the disappearances continued to happen unpredictably and inexplicably. The most shocking case was that of Patricia Mendoza, only 17 years old, and here's the cruel irony of fate. She was the niece of Inspector Carlos Mendoza himself, the man who had investigated the original bus disappearance. In September 1992, 6 years after the initial events, Patricia left home on a Thursday night telling her parents she was going to catch the Souls bus, an expression that had become popular among young people to refer to the ghost bus. Her parents, knowing their daughter's obsession with the case, tried to stop her, but Patricia was of age and managed to escape from home. Patricia's body was found 3 days later in a ravine 15 kilometers from the bus stop where she had been seen for the last time. What shocked investigators was the state in which she was found. Physically intact, with no signs of violence, rape, or any type of aggression, but with an expression of absolute terror frozen on her face. The medical report was completely inconclusive. Patricia was physically perfect, but had died of cardiac arrest caused by extreme terror, something that forensic doctors couldn't explain from a scientific point of view. There was no evidence of drugs, alcohol, or any substance that could have caused hallucinations. It was as if she had literally died of fear. My niece was a brave and intelligent girl, Inspector Mendoza told me, with tears in his eyes. She wasn't afraid of anything. She practiced martial arts, walked alone around the city at dawn without problems. What she saw that night to die of terror like that, I prefer not to imagine. Patricia's death marked a definitive change in authorities' stance regarding the case. What was previously treated as popular superstition began to be seen as a real threat to public safety. Tegucigalpa City Hall installed emergency lighting throughout the El Picacho Hill region and established 24-hour police patrolling. But official measures couldn't prevent the myth from continuing to grow and spread. Today, in 2024, 38 years after that fateful October night, the ghost bus continues to be a constant presence in Tegucigalpa's urban life. Transportation apps like Uber, Bolt, and Didi have a peculiarity in the Honduran capital that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. No registered driver accepts rides to the El Picacho Hill region between 11 p.m. and midnight. There's no official rule prohibiting these rides, but there's a tacit agreement among all drivers based on ancestral fear transmitted from generation to generation. It's a matter of survival. Roberto Gomez, who has been an Uber driver in Tegucigalpa for 6 years, told me, "We all know the stories. It's not worth risking it. There are many places to make money in the city without having to challenge the spirits." Tourists visiting Honduras and trying to book rides to the region during the forbidden hours receive an automatic message informing that there are no available drivers in the area, even when there are dozens of cars connected to the app nearby. But the question that won't go away remains. Where does the brutal reality of the 1980s end, and where does the supernatural legend begin? The Honduras of the 1980s was a country destroyed by violence. Death squads operated with total impunity. The American army maintained military bases in the country to combat Soviet influence in the region. Salvadoran and Nicaraguan war refugees crowded into improvised camps around major cities. People disappeared daily, and the vast majority of cases were never solved. Between 1980 and 1990, more than 3,000 people officially disappeared in Honduras, a number that could be much higher, since many families didn't even report disappearances for fear of reprisals. It's perfectly possible that Bus 47 was the victim of a particularly well-orchestrated criminal attack, where those responsible managed to eliminate all physical evidence. Maybe the bodies of the 25 victims are buried in some clandestine grave that was never discovered. Maybe the bus was completely dismantled and its parts sold in neighboring countries. Maybe the horn sounds that people hear are just psychological echoes of a collective trauma that was never adequately processed by Honduran society. And maybe the survivors, who appeared over the years, were just people with undiagnosed mental problems, seeking attention or suffering from psychotic episodes that made them believe in their own fantasies. These are rational and possible explanations, but there are details that continue to defy any known logic. In 2019, during excavations for the construction of a new shopping center in the region where the bus had disappeared, workers found a metal capsule buried 3 meters deep. Inside it were personal objects that were immediately recognized by the victims' families. Maria Elena Vasquez's brown leather wallet, with all documents and family photos intact. Ramon Castillo's gold wedding ring, with the inscription "Forever, Carmen" engraved inside. And a pink teddy bear that belonged to little Sofia, one of the disappeared children. The most disturbing detail was that all objects were in perfect state of preservation, as if they had been buried the week before, not more than 30 years ago. The wallet's leather was flexible, the photos weren't faded, the ring shone as if it were new, and the teddy bear maintained vivid colors and original soft texture. Forensic analyses performed by Tegucigalpa's criminal laboratory and later confirmed by specialists from the National University confirmed the absolute authenticity of the objects. DNA tests proved that they really belonged to the victims of the disappeared bus. But no scientist could explain how organic materials like leather, paper, and fabric could have been preserved so perfectly after decades buried in the humid soil of the Honduran mountains. It was the strangest thing I've seen in 25 years of career, Dr. Fernando Herrera, the criminal expert responsible for the analyses, told me. From a scientific point of view, those objects should have been completely deteriorated. The leather should have rotted, the photos should have been destroyed by moisture, the teddy bear's fabric should have been in tatters. But they were like new. We have no explanation. The discovery reignited public interest in the case and brought a new generation of investigators, journalists, and curious people to the region. Documentaries were produced, books were written, and conspiracy theories multiplied on social networks. But the most impressive thing is that sighting reports haven't stopped. On the contrary, they seem to have intensified in recent decades. In October 2020, exactly 34 years after the original disappearance, during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic when Tegucigalpa streets were practically deserted due to lockdown, 5 different people reported seeing an old bus traveling the old route during curfew hours. Mariana Castañeda, a nurse who worked at the hospital during the pandemic and had authorization to circulate after 10 p.m., was one of the witnesses. I was returning from my shift around 11:20 p.m. when I saw a bus approaching down the main street. Mariana told me by phone. I found it strange because all public transport was suspended due to the pandemic. When the bus passed by me, I could see it was a very old model, 1980s, painted faded blue and white, with number 47 painted on the side. What most caught Mariana's attention were the bus windows. They were completely fogged from the inside, as if there was a lot of humidity or vapor inside, making it impossible to clearly distinguish passengers' faces. But she could see human silhouettes sitting on the seats. What gave me chills, Mariana continued, was realizing that all silhouettes were completely motionless. Nobody was moving, nobody was looking outside. It was as if they were mannequins or statues, and the bus moved in complete silence. I didn't hear engine noise. I didn't see smoke coming from the exhaust. It was as if it was floating down the street. Jorge Medina, a military police officer who patrolled at night during the pandemic, confirmed Mariana's sighting. We received the radio call and went to check. When we arrived at the location where the nurse said she saw the bus, we found nothing. But there was something strange on the asphalt. 2 perfectly parallel tracks, like tire marks, but without any rubber or oil residue. It was as if some very heavy vehicle had passed there without completely touching the ground. In October 2021, a year later, the phenomenon repeated itself. This time, security cameras from a gas station in the region captured images that went viral on Honduran social networks. The video, which I managed to obtain through police contacts, shows a completely empty street at 11:17 p.m. Suddenly, a dark and elongated shadow begins to project on the asphalt, as if a large vehicle was approaching outside the camera's field of view. The shadow clearly has the shape of a bus, with the characteristic silhouette of windows and body. For about 15 seconds, the shadow travels the entire length of the street, maintaining constant speed. But there's no visible vehicle projecting this shadow. It's as if an invisible bus was passing in front of an also invisible light source. We showed these images to specialists in visual effects and video analysis. Sergeant Luis Martinez from the traffic police told me, "Everyone confirmed there are no signs of editing or digital manipulation. The shadow is real, but we can't explain what's causing it." In October 2022, the most disturbing report of recent years emerged. 3 university students, Sofia Ramos, 20 years old, Pedro Vargas, 21 years old, and Ana Jimenez, 19 years old, were doing an anthropology work on Honduran urban legends. As part of their research, they decided to spend a night in the El Picacho Hill region to scientifically document the supposed paranormal phenomena. Armed with professional audio and video recording equipment, thermometers, electromagnetic field meters, and other scientific instruments, the 3 positioned themselves at the old bus stop at 11 p.m. on October 23rd. We wanted to prove that everything was just collective hysteria and psychological suggestion. Sophia explained to me during an interview I conducted with the group 6 months after the incident. We were complete skeptics. We didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or anything supernatural. At 11:17 p.m., exactly at the historical time of the original disappearance, all the students' electronic equipment began to simultaneously malfunction. Cameras stopped recording, audio recorders emitted only static noise, and electromagnetic field meters went completely haywire. Suddenly, we felt a sharp drop in temperature. Pedro continued the report. In a matter of seconds, The thermal sensation must have dropped about 15 degrees. Our breathing started to form vapor, as if we were in the middle of winter, but it was a normal tropical night. It was then that they heard the sound that would change their lives forever. It started as a distant rumble, but unmistakable, Anna described. It was exactly the sound of an old diesel engine, from those old buses that still circulated when we were children. The sound got louder and louder, coming from the road direction. The three students positioned themselves in the middle of the street, pointing their flashlights toward the direction where the sound was coming from. The engine rumble was accompanied by the characteristic noise of gears being shifted and, finally, by the three long honks that so many witnesses had reported over the years. Then we saw the headlights, Sophia continued, her voice still trembling even months later. Two yellowish and dim lights approaching down the road, exactly at the height where an old bus's headlights would be. The lights came directly toward us. The students remained standing in the middle of the street, determined to document whatever was happening. The lights approached closer and closer, accompanied by the growing sound of the engine and the grinding of brakes being applied. When the lights were about 20 meters from us, we could see a more defined silhouette, Pedro reported. It was definitely a bus. We could distinguish the body, the windows, even the number 47 painted on the side. But there was something wrong. Everything seemed out of focus, as if we were looking through moving water. At 10 meters distance, the ghost bus stopped completely. The engine continued rumbling at idle, and the students could clearly hear the sound of the front door opening with the characteristic pneumatic hiss. That's when we completely lost control of the situation, Anna said, because we started seeing faces in the bus windows. Human faces looking at us. Some looked normal, others were deformed, as if they had suffered some terrible accident. And all of them stared at us in absolute silence. Anna described one of the most disturbing visions. A pregnant woman sitting near a window who kept her hands over her belly in a protective pose. Even from a distance and through the out-of-focus appearance of the bus, Anna could perceive that the woman was obviously dead. Her skin had a bluish coloration, and there was no breathing movement. But the worst of all, Anna continued, was that the woman was looking directly at me, and her lips were moving, as if she was trying to tell me something. I never found out what it was, but I'm sure she was trying to communicate with me. Pedro reported seeing two small children sitting together in one of the back seats. Like the pregnant woman, they were also clearly dead, but their eyes moved following the students' movements on the street. One of the children, a little girl, was holding a pink teddy bear, Pedro described. She raised the teddy bear and waved at me, as if it was a normal game between a living child and an adult. But her face, I'll never be able to forget. It was the face of a child who had been dead for decades trying to play with me. Sophia had the most traumatic vision of all. She could clearly see the driver through the front windshield of the ghost bus. It was a man about 30-something years old, wearing a bus company driver's shirt, Sophia reported. He was sitting normally in the driving position with both hands on the steering wheel. But when he turned his face to look at me, I saw that half of his head was missing, as if he had suffered some terrible injury. And even so, he smiled at me and made a gesture with his hand, as if he was inviting me to board. The three students remained paralyzed for about 2 minutes, observing the impossible scene before them. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the ghost bus began to fade away. It was like watching a television being slowly turned off, Pedro explained. The image became increasingly weak. The sounds gradually diminished, until nothing remained. We were back to being alone on an empty road in the middle of the night. The students' electronic equipment returned to normal functioning a few minutes later, but had recorded absolutely nothing during the sighting period. The cameras showed only the three young people standing on an empty road. The audio recorders captured only the sound of wind and night insects. From a scientific point of view, we had no evidence of what had happened, Sophia concluded. But all three of us saw the same thing, heard the same sounds, experienced the same experience. It wasn't collective hallucination. It wasn't psychological suggestion. It was real, even if we can't prove it. The three students needed psychological counseling for months after the incident. All developed sleep disorders, anxiety, and a total aversion to public transportation. Sophia changed from anthropology to business administration because she didn't want to study things she couldn't understand anymore. And in October 2023, exactly 37 years after the original disappearance, the case gained a new international dimension. A documentary produced by Netflix about unsolved mysteries of Latin America included a 45-minute episode about Tegucigalpa's ghost bus. The episode was watched by more than 20 million people worldwide and brought a flood of tourists and paranormal investigators to Honduras. During the filming of the documentary, the American production team experienced phenomena that were partially captured by professional cameras. Although the image quality doesn't allow definitive conclusions, it's possible to see inexplicable shadows moving through the scenery and hear sounds that can't be identified by audio technicians. We've traveled all over the world filming strange stories. Michael Roberts, the documentary's director, told me during a video conference conversation, "We've been to haunted houses in England, supposedly cursed cemeteries in Mexico, apparition sites in France. But we never experienced anything as intense as in Tegucigalpa. There was a heavy energy in the air that affected all team members." The Netflix episode ends with a question that remains unanswered. Is Tegucigalpa's ghost bus a real supernatural phenomenon or the product of collective trauma not processed by a Netflix society that lived decades of extreme violence? Today, as I record this story for you, reports of new sightings continue to arrive. The Facebook page Misterios de Tegucigalpa receives dozens of monthly testimonies from people who swear they have seen, heard, or felt the presence of the ghost bus. Some are clearly inventions by people seeking attention. Others are reports from impressionable tourists who arrive in the city already expecting to see something strange. But there's a consistent core of local witnesses, people who have lived in the region for decades, who continue to report genuine and disturbing experiences. And all these experiences continue to follow the same pattern established almost 4 decades ago. Always between 11:15 p.m. and 11:45 p.m., always in the El Picacho Hill region, always involving the same sensory elements: sound of diesel engine, 3-horn honks, grinding brakes, hiss of doors opening, and occasionally the vision of an old bus with dead passengers in the windows. What most impresses me, after all these years investigating this case, is the absolute consistency of the reports. People who never knew each other, of different ages, different education levels, different cultural backgrounds, all describe essentially the same impossible experience. If it were just collective hysteria or psychological suggestion, significant variations in testimonies would be expected. Different people would invent different details or interpret the same stimuli in different ways. But that's not what happens. The reports are too consistent to be a pure product of imagination. On the other hand, if it were a completely real and physical phenomenon, it would be expected that at least some material evidence would have been captured over 4 decades of attempts. But with the exception of shadows filmed by security cameras and personal objects found in 2019, there's no concrete proof of the ghost bus's existence. We're facing a mystery that defies both purely rational and purely supernatural explanations. And maybe that's exactly what makes this story so fascinating and haunting. Because ultimately, the question isn't necessarily whether the ghost bus exists or not. The question is, what happens to a society when the boundary between reality and nightmare becomes so tenuous that we can no longer distinguish one thing from the other? The Honduras of the 1980s was a place where people really disappeared without leaving traces, where entire families were eliminated by death squads, where violence was so extreme and systematic that it surpassed the limits of what the human mind can normally process. Maybe the ghost bus is the way the Honduran collective unconscious found to deal with traumas that were never adequately elaborated. Maybe it's the psychic manifestation of a social pain that never had the opportunity to be healed. Or maybe it's exactly what it appears to be. The spirits of 25 innocent people who were brutally murdered on an October night and who can't find rest until the truth about their death is revealed. I don't have definitive answers to offer you. After years researching this case, interviewing hundreds of people, analyzing official documents and physical evidence, I remain as perplexed as the day I first heard about the ghost bus. What I can say with certainty is that something extraordinary and inexplicable continues to happen on the streets of Tegucigalpa, and that 25 real people with names, faces, stories, and families who loved them disappeared forever on that fateful night in 1986. Maria Elena Vasquez never hugged her daughter again. Ramon Castillo never returned home to have dinner with his wife and 3 children. The children Sofia and Alejandro never played in their grandmother's backyard again. Rosa Maria never saw the baby she carried in her womb. These are the real victims of this story. It doesn't matter whether or not there's a ghost bus eternally traveling the roads of Honduras. What matters is that real people died, and their families never had the right to proper mourning because they never knew exactly what happened to their loved ones. So, the next time you're alone on a dark street and hear the distant sound of an engine approaching, the next time you hear a horn honking 3 times in the early morning, the next time you feel an inexplicable chill running down your spine on a silent night, remember that behind every urban legend there are real people who suffered real tragedies. And that maybe, just maybe, some stories aren't just stories. Maybe they're calls for help echoing through time. Because in the end, whether the ghost bus of Tegucigalpa is real or not, the pain of those who lost loved ones that October night is absolutely, undeniably real. And until we find answers for them, the mystery will continue to haunt the streets of the Honduran capital, searching for the peace that only truth can bring. The bus may be a ghost, but the suffering is human. And that, more than any supernatural phenomenon, is what should truly terrify us. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what's the most haunting urban legend from your city? And remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved.